when 67-year-old retired farmer Henry Wilson defied evacuation orders to check on his abandoned property one last time. He never expected to find a magnificent Mustang stallion left behind in the chaos of California's deadliest wildfire. The massive horse was trapped in a neighbor's corral with no food, no water, and flames advancing rapidly toward his location. Henry's decision to risk his life saving a wild horse he'd never met would trigger a chain of miraculous events that would restore his faith in purpose, community, and the incredible bonds that can form between the most unlikely companions. This is a story that proves miracles often come disguised as opportunities to help others when we need help ourselves. Henry Wilson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck as he drove through the smoke-filled roads toward his abandoned farm. The 67-year-old retired farmer had evacuated 3 days earlier when the Paradise Creek fire exploded across Northern California, but something kept pulling him back to check on the property he'd worked for 40 years. Henry wore his standard farm clothes, worn jeans, flannel shirt, and work boots that had walked every acre of his 160-acre spread. His gray hair showed beneath a faded baseball cap, and his lined face reflected decades of working under the California sun. Since his wife Martha had passed 2 years ago, the farm had been his only companion, and leaving it felt like abandoning family. Just a quick look, Henry told himself as ash fell like snow on his windshield. The fire had jumped Highway 20 during the night, and authorities had extended evacuation orders to include his valley. Most neighbors had already fled, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned livestock that couldn't be evacuated in time. The smoke was so thick that Henry almost missed it, a desperate whinnying coming from the Hendersons' property next to his own. The young couple had evacuated with their children, but hadn't mentioned anything about horses when they said goodbye at the emergency shelter. Henry stopped his truck and peered through the orange-tinted gloom toward the sound. In a small corral behind the Henderson house, a magnificent Mustang stallion paced frantically along the fence line. The horse was coal-black with a distinctive white blaze down his face, easily 16 hands tall and powerfully built. "What the hell?" Henry muttered, grabbing his binoculars from the truck. Through the lenses, he could see the stallion's condition clearly. No food in the corral, water trough bone dry, and the horse showing signs of severe dehydration and panic. Henry's farmer instincts told him immediately what had happened. The Hendersons had probably been caring for the Mustang temporarily, perhaps as part of a wild horse adoption program. When the evacuation order came suddenly, they'd had to choose between saving their children and saving a wild horse they barely knew. The stallion, whom Henry would later name Blaze for his white facial marking, was trapped in a corral that had become a death sentence. The wooden fencing was too high for him to jump, and the gate was secured with a chain that the panicked horse couldn't manipulate. "Easy, boy," Henry called out as he approached the corral, though his voice was barely audible over the roar of approaching flames on the distant ridge. The fire was moving faster than predicted, and Henry estimated he had maybe 2 hours before it reached the valley floor. Blaze's reaction to Henry's presence was immediate and dramatic. The stallion reared up against the fence, his powerful hooves striking the wooden rails as he tried to escape this new threat. Wild Mustangs had no positive associations with humans, and Blaze saw Henry as another danger in an already terrifying situation. "I'm not here to hurt you," Henry said softly, though he knew the horse couldn't understand his words. "I'm here to get you out of this death trap." Henry's mind raced as he assessed the situation. Opening the corral gate would free Blaze, but a panicked wild stallion could easily injure or kill an elderly man who got in his way. Leaving Blaze trapped meant certain death when the fire arrived. Taking the horse to safety meant somehow convincing a terrified wild animal to trust a human he'd never met. As Henry fumbled with the chain securing the gate, he could see the flames cresting the ridge above them. Orange light flickered through the smoke, and the temperature was rising noticeably even at this distance. Time was running out for both of them. The moment the gate swung open, Blaze exploded out of the corral like a force of nature, nearly trampling Henry in his desperate bid for freedom. But instead of running toward safety, the confused stallion galloped directly toward the approaching fire, his survival instincts overwhelmed by panic and disorientation from the smoke. Henry realized with growing horror that saving Blaze was going to require much more than simply opening a gate. Henry jumped into his pickup truck and followed Blaze's desperate flight toward the advancing fire line, his heart pounding as he watched the magnificent stallion head directly into the path of destruction. The smoke was so thick that Blaze couldn't see the danger ahead, and his wild instincts were leading him towards certain death. "Come on, old truck," Henry muttered as he pushed his vehicle across the rough pasture land, trying to intercept Blaze before the horse reached the fire's leading edge. At 67, Henry hadn't attempted anything this physically demanding in years, but something about the trapped stallion had awakened protective instincts he thought he'd lost when Martha died. Blaze was running blind through the smoke, stumbling over irrigation ditches and fence lines he couldn't see. The stallion's panic was complete. He was no longer thinking, just reacting to the overwhelming sensory assault of smoke, heat, and the approaching roar of the wildfire. Henry managed to get ahead of Blaze and position his truck as a barrier, forcing the stallion to stop his headlong rush toward the flames. The horse reared and spun, looking for escape routes, while Henry slowly climbed out of his vehicle with his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy, Blaze," Henry said, using the name that had come to him the moment he'd seen the horse's distinctive white marking. "I know you're scared, but running that way means death for both of us." The stallion's dark eyes were wide with terror as he assessed this elderly human who had appeared in his path. Blaze's coat was lathered with sweat, and his breathing was labored from the combination of panic and smoke inhalation. Henry could see that the horse was on the verge of complete exhaustion. "Listen to me, boy," Henry continued, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone he'd used with livestock for 4 decades. "I've worked with horses my whole life, and I know you can understand tone even if you don't know words." Henry began moving slowly toward his truck's trailer hitch, where he kept a lead rope for emergencies. Getting a rope on a panicked wild stallion was normally impossible, but these weren't normal circumstances. If Henry couldn't somehow convince Blaze to follow him to safety, they would both die in the approaching fire. The breakthrough came when Blaze seemed to recognize that Henry was offering help rather than representing a threat. The stallion's ears flicked forward as Henry spoke, and his posture began to shift from pure panic toward cautious assessment of this unexpected situation. "That's it," Henry encouraged as Blaze took a tentative step toward him. "You're smart enough to know I'm trying to help." Getting the lead rope around Blaze's neck required every bit of Henry's experience with frightened animals. He moved with glacial slowness, speaking constantly in soothing tones while the fire crept closer to their position. When the rope finally settled around the stallion's powerful neck, both man and horse seemed to sigh with relief. "Now we run," Henry said, leading Blaze toward his truck as the first flames became visible through the trees behind them. The stallion followed willingly now, understanding that this human represented his only chance of survival. The journey back to Henry's farm became a race against time as the fire exploded through the dry vegetation behind them. Henry drove slowly to keep pace with Blaze, who trotted alongside the truck, with the lead rope providing just enough security to keep him focused on following rather than fleeing. "Almost there, boy," Henry called through his open window as they approached the relative safety of his property. The farm sat in a natural depression with irrigated fields that might provide a fire break if they were lucky. But as they reached Henry's barnyard, both man and horse realized their ordeal was far from over. The fire had jumped ahead of them through spotting, and flames were now visible on 3 sides of the property. They were trapped in what might become their final refuge, with a wild stallion who still barely trusted the elderly farmer who had risked everything to save him. Henry looked at Blaze's magnificent form standing in his farmyard and realized that saving the horse might have condemned them both. But as the flames closed in around them, something miraculous began to happen that would test the bond they had formed in their desperate flight from death. Henry's farm was surrounded by walls of flame that turned the evening sky orange and filled the air with ash and burning embers. The fire had moved faster than anyone predicted, cutting off all escape routes and trapping Henry and Blaze in what might become their final sanctuary. "Well, boy, looks like we're in this together," Henry said to Blaze as they stood in the barnyard watching flames advance from 3 directions. The stallion remained close to Henry now, understanding that this human was his only ally in a world that had become completely hostile. Henry's 40 years of farming experience had taught him to prepare for disasters, and his property offered their best chance of survival. The barn sat near a large irrigation pond that he'd built for drought years, and the surrounding pastures were green from recent watering. If they could reach the pond and create a fire break, they might survive until help arrived. "Come on, Blaze," Henry said, leading the stallion toward the pond while burning embers fell around them like deadly snow. "Time to see if an old farmer and a wild horse can outsmart a wildfire." Blaze followed Henry willingly, his wild instincts now completely focused on the human who had become his anchor in the chaos. The bond between them had deepened through shared danger, and the stallion seemed to understand that their survival depended on cooperation. Henry began flooding the pasture around the pond using his irrigation system, creating a wet perimeter that might slow the fire's advance. Blaze watched with obvious intelligence as Henry worked, and when the farmer struggled to move a heavy irrigation pipe, the stallion positioned himself to help bear the weight. "You're something special," Henry gasped as Blaze assisted with the physical labor of preparing their defense. "I've never seen a horse understand human intentions this quickly." The most dangerous moment came when wind-driven flames jumped across the irrigation ditch and began consuming the barn where Henry stored his equipment and emergency supplies. Both Henry and Blaze were forced to retreat to the pond itself, standing chest-deep in water while burning debris fell around them. "Stay close to me," Henry instructed as Blaze pressed against his side in the water. The stallion's natural fear of confinement was overcome by his trust in Henry, and he remained perfectly still even when burning branches crashed into the pond around them. They spent 4 hours in the water together as the fire raged through Henry's property, destroying buildings and equipment he'd accumulated over decades of farming. Henry found himself talking to Blaze constantly, sharing memories of Martha, stories about the farm, and hopes for their survival. "Martha would have loved you," Henry told the stallion as they waited for the flames to pass. "She always said I needed something to care about besides the farm. Guess she sent you to me." Blaze's response was to rest his massive head against Henry's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that brought tears to the old farmer's eyes. In the space of one terrifying day, a wild stallion had become family in ways Henry hadn't experienced since losing his wife. When dawn finally broke through the smoke, Henry and Blaze emerged from the pond to survey a landscape transformed by fire. The barn was gone, along with most of the outbuildings, but the house had survived, and the irrigated fields had created enough of a firebreak to save the core of the property. "We made it, boy," Henry said, wrapping his arms around Blaze's neck as the stallion nuzzled his shoulder. "We actually made it." But their survival was just the beginning of what would become a miraculous transformation for both of them. As rescue teams arrived to assess fire damage, they would discover something that challenged everything they thought they knew about relationships between humans and wild horses. The miracle Henry and Blaze had created together in their fight for survival was about to inspire an entire community and prove that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most extraordinary results. Their story of mutual rescue was just beginning, and the best was yet to come. 2 weeks after the fire, Henry's property had become an unofficial sanctuary for displaced animals and their owners who had lost everything in the disaster. News of the elderly farmer who had risked his life to save a wild stallion had spread through the fire-affected communities, attracting people who needed to believe in hope after losing everything. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a 42-year-old veterinarian with long black hair and compassionate brown eyes, arrived to check on Blaze's condition after hearing about the remarkable bond between the retired farmer and the wild horse. Her examination revealed something that shocked her professional understanding of human-animal relationships. "Henry, what you've achieved with Blaze is unprecedented," Dr. Martinez explained as she watched the stallion calmly accept medical examination while Henry held his lead rope. Wild Mustangs typically require months of specialized training before they'll tolerate this level of human contact. Blaze had not only learned to trust Henry completely, but had begun seeking out the old farmer's company whenever possible. The stallion would follow Henry around the property like a massive dog, helping with farm chores and providing emotional support that Henry hadn't realized he desperately needed. "He saved me as much as I saved him," Henry admitted as he watched Blaze gently nuzzle a young girl whose family had lost their home in the fire. "Since Martha died, I've been going through the motions of living. Blaze gave me purpose again." The transformation in both Henry and Blaze was remarkable to witness. The elderly farmer, who had been withdrawn and depressed since his wife's death, was now energetic and engaged with life again. Blaze, meanwhile, had evolved from a terrified wild animal into a gentle giant who seemed to understand that his role was to provide comfort to anyone who needed it. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez marveled as Blaze allowed a traumatized child to sit on his back while Henry provided gentle guidance. "This stallion is demonstrating therapeutic behaviors that we spend years trying to teach domestic horses." Word of the miracle partnership between Henry and Blaze reached local news outlets, bringing reporters and documentary crews to witness something that defied scientific explanation. A wild Mustang stallion was voluntarily serving as a therapy horse for fire victims, guided by an elderly farmer who had found new meaning in his golden years. "Every morning, people show up here looking for hope," Henry told a news crew as they filmed Blaze interacting with fire survivors. "Blaze seems to know exactly what each person needs. Sometimes it's just a gentle touch. Sometimes it's the strength to know that survival is possible." The most remarkable development was how Blaze had begun to recognize and respond to human emotional distress. When someone arrived at the property in crisis, the stallion would immediately approach them with gentle, comforting behavior that often brought healing where traditional therapy had failed. Sarah Thompson, a 34-year-old teacher who had lost her home and classroom in the fire, became one of Blaze's most devoted visitors. "I was ready to quit teaching, quit everything," she explained as Blaze stood calmly while she brushed his coat. "Then I met this horse who survived the same fire I did, and somehow he made me believe that starting over was possible." Dr. Martinez began documenting the therapeutic interactions between Blaze and fire survivors, recognizing that they were witnessing the birth of something revolutionary in animal-assisted therapy. Blaze is self-selecting his therapy clients and adapting his behavior to their specific needs without any formal training, she reported in her research notes. But the most profound miracle was the transformation in Henry himself. The lonely widower who had been slowly fading away had become a community leader, organizing support networks for fire victims and serving as proof that it's never too late to discover new purpose in life. "Martha always said that miracles happen when we stop thinking about ourselves and start helping others," Henry reflected as he watched Blaze provide comfort to yet another family who had lost everything. "I thought saving Blaze was about rescuing a horse, but really he rescued me." As autumn approached and the fire-damaged landscape began showing signs of recovery, Henry and Blaze had become symbols of hope and resilience for an entire region. Their story was about to inspire changes that would extend far beyond their small corner of California. 6 months after the fire, Henry's property had been transformed into the Miracle Ranch, an official nonprofit organization providing animal-assisted therapy for trauma survivors throughout Northern California. What had started as one man saving one horse had grown into a revolutionary approach to disaster recovery that was attracting attention from around the world. We're seeing breakthrough results with PTSD patients who haven't responded to traditional therapy, explained Dr. Michael Chen, a 48-year-old trauma specialist with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses who had come to study the unique therapeutic environment Henry and Blaze had created. Blaze had become the lead therapy horse in a program that now included 12 rescued animals, but his bond with Henry remained the foundation of everything they accomplished. The stallion seemed to understand that his role extended beyond providing comfort. He was teaching other rescue animals how to connect with humans who had experienced trauma. Watch how Blaze introduces new animals to the therapy work, Dr. Martinez observed as the stallion guided a recently rescued mare through her first interaction with a fire survivor. He's actually training other horses to provide therapeutic support. Henry, now 68 and more energetic than he had been in years, had become an internationally recognized expert in disaster recovery and animal therapy. Universities invited him to speak about the unexpected healing power that could emerge from crisis situations, and his story with Blaze had inspired similar programs across the country. "I used to think my life was over when Martha died," Henry told a gathering of disaster response professionals. "Blaze taught me that sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself in our darkest moments." The Miracle Ranch had documented over 300 successful therapy interactions, with participants reporting significant improvements in anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms after working with Blaze and the other rescue animals. Insurance companies were beginning to cover the therapy sessions, recognizing their effectiveness compared to traditional treatments. Maria Santos, a 29-year-old social worker with curly brown hair and warm eyes, had joined the ranch full-time to coordinate the therapy programs and document their outcomes. "What we're seeing here challenges fundamental assumptions about trauma recovery," she explained to visiting researchers. "These animals are providing healing that medication and counseling alone couldn't achieve." The most remarkable development was how Blaze had begun training human volunteers to work with trauma survivors. The stallion would demonstrate specific approaches for different types of emotional distress, essentially teaching people how to provide more effective support to those in crisis. "He's become a teacher," Henry marveled as he watched Blaze show a new volunteer how to approach someone experiencing a panic attack. "This horse is educating humans about healing techniques that he developed instinctively." The ranch's success had attracted funding from major foundations and government grants, allowing Henry to expand the program while maintaining its core philosophy of mutual healing between humans and animals. Every rescue animal that joined the program had experienced trauma, creating authentic connections with human survivors. "Both the animals and the people understand what it means to lose everything and fight to rebuild," Dr. Chen documented in his research. "That shared experience creates bonds that traditional therapy relationships can't replicate." The most touching moment came when the Henderson family, who had originally been caring for Blaze before the evacuation, returned to visit the ranch. Their young daughter Emma, now 8 years old with blonde pigtails and bright blue eyes, had been traumatized by the fire and their forced abandonment of Blaze. "I thought Blaze died because we left him," Emma confessed as the stallion gently nuzzled her hands. "I felt bad every day." Blaze's reunion with the Henderson family provided closure for everyone involved, demonstrating that the miracle of survival and healing extended to all who had been touched by the original crisis. The stallion's forgiveness and obvious joy at seeing them again helped heal guilt that had been weighing on the family for months. As winter approached, Henry looked out over a property that bore no resemblance to the lonely farm he'd been ready to abandon just 1 year earlier. The Miracle Ranch was thriving, Blaze was healthy and purposeful, and hundreds of people had found healing through the program they'd created together. But the greatest miracle was yet to come, as their story was about to inspire changes in disaster response and trauma therapy that would benefit communities around the world. 1 year after the Paradise Creek fire, Henry and Blaze's story had become the foundation for a new field of study called crisis bond therapy, recognized by major universities and implemented in disaster response protocols worldwide. The elderly farmer and the wild stallion had proven that the most profound healing often emerges from the most unlikely partnerships. What Henry and Blaze discovered has revolutionized our understanding of trauma recovery, announced Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 52-year-old psychology professor with silver hair and passionate blue eyes, during the first international conference on animal-assisted crisis recovery held at the Miracle Ranch. The ranch now hosted researchers, trauma specialists, and disaster response teams from around the globe who came to study the therapeutic methods that had emerged naturally from Henry and Blaze's survival bond. Their approach was being replicated in fire-damaged communities across California, Australia, and Greece. The key insight is that healing accelerates when both human and animal have experienced similar trauma, explained Dr. Martinez, who had become the ranch's chief research coordinator. Traditional therapy animals are trained to provide comfort, but rescue animals provide understanding. Henry had been invited to address the United Nations Disaster Response Committee about incorporating animal-assisted therapy into international relief efforts. At 68, the retired farmer found himself traveling the world to share lessons learned from one desperate night, fighting fire alongside a terrified stallion. Blaze taught me that miracles aren't supernatural events, Henry told the UN Assembly. They're what happen when ordinary beings choose to help each other survive impossible circumstances. Blaze, now recognized as the first certified crisis recovery horse, continued to serve as the ranch's lead therapist while training a new generation of rescue animals. His intelligence and empathy had been documented in peer-reviewed research that challenged traditional understanding of animal consciousness and emotional capacity. The stallion's most remarkable achievement was his work with children who had experienced trauma. Blaze seemed to recognize that young survivors needed different support than adults, adapting his therapeutic approach to provide the security and playfulness that helped children process devastating experiences. He plays with them until they laugh, then comforts them when they cry, observed Maria Santos, who had completed her doctoral thesis on Blaze's therapeutic methods. This horse understands childhood trauma recovery better than most trained professionals. The Miracle Ranch had expanded to include educational programs for veterinarians, social workers, and disaster response teams who wanted to incorporate animal-assisted therapy into their work. Henry's practical wisdom combined with Blaze's intuitive healing abilities created training programs that were being implemented internationally. The most significant recognition came when the American Psychological Association established the Henry Wilson and Blaze Award for innovations in trauma therapy, acknowledging that a retired farmer and a rescued Mustang had contributed more to the field than decades of traditional research. We thought we were saving each other from a fire, Henry reflected during the award ceremony as Blaze stood calmly beside him on stage. We had no idea we were creating a new way to heal from life's disasters. The ranch's success had inspired legislation protecting disaster-displaced animals and funding programs that connected trauma survivors with rescue animals. Henry's story proved that crisis situations could become opportunities for transformational healing when approached with courage and compassion. Emma Henderson, now 9 years old, had become one of the ranch's youngest volunteers, working with Blaze to help other children overcome trauma. Her own healing journey from guilt and fear to confidence and purpose demonstrated the long-term impact of the miracle that had begun with one man's decision to save one horse. Blaze taught me that being scared doesn't make you weak, Emma explained to new participants in the children's program. It makes you brave when you help others even though you're scared too. As Henry approached his 69th birthday, he looked back on a year that had transformed him from a lonely widower into a global advocate for compassionate disaster response. The Miracle Ranch employed 12 full-time staff members, hosted researchers from 6 countries, and provided therapy services to over 1,000 trauma survivors annually. Martha would be amazed, Henry told Dr. Martinez as they watched Blaze lead a therapy session with wildfire survivors from 3 different states. She always said I had more to give than I realized. Took a wild horse to show me she was right. Blaze's legacy extended far beyond individual healing to systemic changes in how communities respond to disaster trauma. The stallion had demonstrated that recovery wasn't just about rebuilding structures and infrastructure. It was about rebuilding the connections between beings that make survival meaningful. Every person who finds healing here carries that hope into their community, Henry observed as participants in the ranch's programs returned to their hometowns as advocates for innovative trauma therapy. Blaze and I started something that will keep growing long after we're gone. The miracle that began with an elderly farmer's decision to save a trapped horse had become a movement that was transforming disaster recovery around the world, proving that the greatest changes often start with simple acts of courage performed by ordinary beings in extraordinary circumstances. Henry and Blaze's incredible journey from a desperate rescue during California's deadliest wildfire to founding a revolutionary trauma therapy program proves that miracles aren't magical events. They're what happen when courage meets compassion in the face of impossible circumstances. Their story shows us that our greatest purpose often reveals itself in our darkest moments, and that the healing we provide to others becomes the healing we receive ourselves. The Miracle Ranch stands as testament to the transformative power of choosing hope over despair and action over resignation. Henry's decision to risk his life for a trapped Mustang didn't just save Blaze. It created a legacy of healing that has touched thousands of lives and changed how the world responds to trauma and disaster. Today, crisis bond therapy programs inspired by Henry and Blaze operate on 5 continents, providing hope and healing to trauma survivors while giving rescue animals purpose and family. Their story continues to inspire new approaches to disaster recovery that recognize the profound connections between all beings seeking to survive and thrive. If this story inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage and the miraculous outcomes that emerge when ordinary people choose extraordinary compassion. Leave a like if Henry and Blaze's journey touched your heart, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to discover new purpose, and that help often comes from the most unexpected sources. What would you risk to save a life that others had given up on? Let us know in the comments, and remember, sometimes the most profound miracles begin with simple acts of kindness performed when no one is watching.
A German shepherd stood frozen at the edge of the airfield, his sable coat streaked with oil, his eyes locked on a man being dragged into the shadows of a hangar. No one noticed the dog. No one heard the silent cry beneath the roar of departing aircraft. But deep in the heart of the base, someone had planted death in a pilot's seat, and 3 innocent men were about to be framed for it. He wasn't trained to understand betrayal, but he knew the scent of danger and the soul of the man who once saved him. What happened next will shake you, break you, and remind you that sometimes God's protection comes on 4 legs. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe heaven sends help in unexpected ways, hit subscribe and type amen below. The morning air over Eagle Ridge Air Base cut like a blade, crisp, dry, and unforgiving. Situated on the outskirts of Fort Carson, Colorado, the sprawling military installation lay wrapped in a thin veil of frost. The tarmac shimmered with ice residue beneath a pale winter sun, and the skeletal silhouettes of C-17 Globemasters loomed against a backdrop of pine ridges and steel hangars. It was 5:42 a.m., and the world was quiet, save for the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground and the distant hum of auxiliary power units warming up aircraft. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cross, 31, walked with steady purpose, his breath forming short bursts of fog in the frigid air. He was a man of wiry build, standing just under 6 feet, with a sharp jawline, closely cropped dark blonde hair, and gray-blue eyes that had seen more than they revealed. A 5-year veteran of the Air Force Security Forces, Daniel had a quiet intensity to him, disciplined, observant, and never one for idle conversation. The kind of man who didn't crack jokes but earned trust with consistency and silence. The bronze security badge on his chest bore more than rank. It carried the weight of a responsibility he took seriously. Beside him trotted his partner of 3 years, Rex, a German shepherd with a sable black coat and a muscular, commanding frame. At 5 years old, Rex moved with the grace of a trained athlete and the precision of a tactician. His almond-shaped amber eyes scanned everything. Baggage trolleys, mechanics in reflective jackets, soldiers boarding buses in formation. Rex's right ear had a small notch, a scar from a mission gone wrong, when a warehouse nearly exploded from an unnoticed fuel leak. It had been Rex who picked up the chemical signature in time, alerting Daniel, who sounded the evacuation. That act alone had saved 24 airmen. Since then, no one on base questioned Rex's instincts. He was quiet, unlike the more excitable dogs in the K-9 unit, and unnervingly perceptive. He was known to freeze and stare for full minutes at a backpack or locker, only to later uncover something the machines had missed. Daniel had come to think of him less like a dog and more like a thinking partner. They communicated in glances, small gestures, subtle tugs on the leash. Rex had his own rhythm, and Daniel had long since learned to follow it. They were stationed this morning at Gate B4, where personnel scheduled to board the outbound C-17 underwent final clearance. The aircraft was slated for a long-range transport mission across state lines. No classified cargo, but enough equipment and personnel on board to warrant protocol. Most of the security checks were routine. ID scans, badge validations, gear inspections. As Daniel nodded to the technician manning the checkpoint console, Rex moved in cadence, his nose brushing against duffel bags with calm confidence. The cold bit through Daniel's gloves, but he didn't complain. He never did. The cold was better than desert heat. Just past 5:50, a tall figure approached from the western barracks. A man in a clean regulation-pressed blue overcoat, wool gloves, and an officer's cap tilted precisely over iron-gray hair. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kane. He was well known across Eagle Ridge. 56 years old, meticulous, commanding without needing to raise his voice. Rumor had it he'd flown over 3,000 hours in his career and had once taught strategy at Maxwell Air Force Base. He walked like he was born in uniform. Broad-shouldered, deeply tanned from years under open sky, Kane exuded authority. But Rex reacted. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation in his gait, the way his eyes locked onto Kane's left side. Then came the growl. Low, guttural, a sound Daniel hadn't heard in months. Rex braced his legs and stepped sideways, cutting across Kane's path. His hackles lifted. Daniel tightened the leash instantly, issuing the low whistle they used to signal a reset. But Rex didn't budge. His body had stiffened into a wall of focused defiance, eyes burning into Kane's uniform. Kane halted, visibly startled. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" he asked, voice clipped with a trace of indignation. Daniel stood straight, eyes flicking between Rex and the officer. "Apologies, sir. My partner's showing alert behavior. I'll need to conduct a secondary check." "I'm due to be in the air within the hour," Kane said, tone tightening. "I don't have time for your dog to act up." "This checkpoint requires compliance from all boarding personnel, sir. It'll take less than 2 minutes." "I've passed 3 levels of security already," Kane argued. "Are you suggesting I'm a threat?" "No, sir," Daniel replied calmly, though his heart had begun to beat harder. "But I trust this dog with my life, and he's never reacted like this without cause." By now, the technician at the desk had gone silent, watching. Daniel keyed the mic clip to his shoulder. Gate B4 to control, requesting oversight for security anomaly. Subject: Lieutenant Colonel Kane, requesting presence of shift supervisor for authorizing elevated protocol. A crackle responded, followed by a composed voice. Acknowledged, B4. Supervisor Holt en route. Within 3 minutes, footsteps approached from the side corridor. First Lieutenant Sarah Holt, 35, emerged from the passageway. She was tall, lean, and always impeccably put together. Standard fatigues under a navy cold-weather coat, blonde hair in a tight braid, pale complexion flushed from the cold. A former military policewoman turned security force officer, Sarah was known across the base for being methodical and emotionally reserved. A deployment in Ramstein years earlier had left her with a permanent limp in her right knee, a roadside IED that took out the Humvee she was riding in. Since then, she had been transferred to domestic command, bringing with her an unshakable sense of procedure and a cool, no-nonsense demeanor that some mistook for aloofness. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "What's going on, Cross?" she asked, eyes already scanning Kane and Rex. "Ma'am," Daniel replied crisply, "Rex is showing heightened alert behavior. Subject attempted to proceed, but Rex blocked his path. No prior history of aggression. requesting elevated inspection. She studied the dog first. Rex was tense, but not agitated. Focused. Silent now, but still squarely positioned between Kane and the gate. She knew that stance. She'd seen it in Germany when another K9 had caught wind of nitrate traces no machine picked up. "Lieutenant Colonel Kane," she said, voice even, "this will only take a few minutes. We're required to follow up on K9 alerts at this security level." Kane's jaw worked. "This is absurd. I have a mission manifest and clearance on record." "We understand, sir," she replied, "but this isn't about your record. It's about your proximity to an aircraft that carries military personnel and high-value cargo. If the dog says we need to look twice, we do," Kane huffed. "Fine, but file this as a formal delay." Sarah gave a short nod. "Duly noted. Proceed to holding room Bravo. We'll initiate the scan there." As Daniel led Rex away from the gate, the shepherd glanced back once over his shoulder, eyes fixed on the officer's collar. Daniel whispered, "I believe you, boy. I always do." Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kane sat stiffly on the metal chair in holding room Bravo, his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap, jaw clenched. The room was unheated, its white-painted cinder block walls lit by harsh fluorescent strips that flickered slightly, casting the occasional jump of shadow across the concrete floor. The air inside carried that sterile military scent, rubber soles, machine oil, and the ever-present trace of cold steel. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cross stood silently near the door, one gloved hand resting lightly on the leash looped around his left wrist. Rex, his 5-year-old German shepherd partner, sat at his heel, but with none of the relaxed posture Daniel usually saw. The dog was rigid, ears forward, eyes locked on Kane, not barking, not growling, but watching like a drawn bow. Kane's irritation was now tinged with growing impatience. "If this is some power play to assert protocol, Sergeant," he said without looking up, "you're delaying a critical deployment. That C-17 is loaded with avionics crates bound for Elmendorf. We are already 30 minutes behind schedule due to frost delays. You'll answer for this." Daniel didn't flinch. "We follow procedure, sir. The moment my K9 alerts, we initiate extended screening, standard regulation." "I've passed screening in 2 separate sectors before I even entered this checkpoint," Kane snapped. "The idea that your animal is overriding layered security is ridiculous." Daniel didn't reply. He had learned long ago that arguing with senior officers during protocol situations only delayed the inevitable. It was better to stay quiet, follow steps, and let Rex's instincts do the talking. The door opened with a metallic click. First Lieutenant Sarah Holt entered, a clipboard in one hand and her other adjusting the collar of her fleece-lined field jacket. She looked like she'd walked through the snow rather than around it, her boots damp, braids slightly frizzed near the temples. Her expression remained composed as always, but Daniel noted the faint lines of concern tightening around her eyes. "We've initiated the hold log," she said, stepping beside Daniel without addressing Kane directly. "Control has been notified. If the secondary screen takes longer than 10 minutes, we escalate to base ops." Kane scoffed. "That will go on record then. 2 NCOs delaying a field-grade officer over nothing." Sarah raised one brow slightly. "Let's hope it is nothing, sir. It'll make for a short report." She turned to Daniel. "Proceed with handheld scan." Daniel withdrew the compact unit from its hard case, powered it up, and moved to Kane's left side. "Arms out, sir." Kane rolled his eyes but complied, standing up straight and extending his arms like a man at a tailor. The handheld device, a rectangular unit no larger than a brick, hummed softly as it passed over his torso, arms, and down each leg. A few green beeps, all standard. When Daniel reached the collar, Rex stirred. A faint growl vibrated through the leash. The scanner gave a steady tone. Neutral. No alerts. Daniel frowned. He passed over the same area again. Still nothing. Sarah watched silently. The machine confirmed Kane was clean. Daniel hesitated. "He's still fixated," he muttered, nodding toward Rex. Kane lowered his arms. "Enough, Sergeant. The machine cleared me." Sarah didn't respond right away. Her eyes weren't on Kane anymore. They were on Rex. The dog had risen to all fours, his hackles lifted. Without warning, he took a step forward, leaned in, and let out a sharp bark, explosive in the small room. Before Daniel could tighten the leash, Rex lunged and planted both paws on Kane's chest, barking again and pawing directly at the left lapel of Kane's uniform coat. Kane staggered back. "Get him off me!" he barked, grabbing the edge of a nearby table. "Rex, heel!" Daniel commanded, pulling the leash back. But Rex remained locked, tail stiff, mouth open in a sharp snarl, refusing to let go of visual contact. Sarah stepped forward immediately, voice low but firm. "Stand down, both of you. Sergeant, secure the dog." Daniel tugged again. "Rex, heel!" This time Rex backed down slowly, lowering his paws but not his head. Kane was panting lightly, cheeks flushed. "That animal is out of control." Sarah didn't speak right away. She studied the collar of Kane's coat where Rex had made repeated contact. Her gaze narrowed. "Sergeant Cross," she said calmly, "contact Tech Group Delta. I want the portable imaging unit brought to this room. Now." Kane stared at her. "This is outrageous." Sarah finally met his eyes. "If your coat is clean, sir, we'll be done in 10 minutes and I'll personally file the clearance myself. But if you attempt to board an Air Force transport while wearing something that makes a trained K-9 behave like this, then we owe it to everyone on that aircraft to be thorough." Daniel keyed his radio. "B4 to Delta Tech, requesting X-ray Unit Bravo to holding room. K-9 escalation triggered. Priority level 2. As the room settled back into silence, a new figure entered. Airman First Class Devin Locke, a tall, freckle-faced technician with sandy hair and thick glasses. Devin was 22, fresh out of technical school, but showed a precision and steadiness rare for his rank. He spoke little, preferred data to discussion, and had a reputation for reading flight manifests like they were code books. He nodded once to Sarah, wheeled in the imaging cart, and got to work assembling the screen and calibrating the scanner head. Kane, now seated again, exhaled slowly. "You'll regret this when nothing shows up." "Possibly," Sarah replied evenly. "But if we're wrong, the worst we'll face is paperwork. If we're right, well, that's a different report entirely." Rex sat once more at Daniel's feet, posture rigid, his gaze unrelenting. The quiet hum of the imaging scanner filled the room, a low mechanical purr that seemed almost too soft for the weight of the moment. Holding Room Bravo had become a pressure chamber, silent, cold, and breathless. The portable imaging unit, brought in minutes ago by Airman Devin Locke, now hovered over the subject in question, the left lapel of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kane's uniform coat. The scanner's arm moved slowly, methodically, as instructed by the technician's steady hand. Devin Locke adjusted the controls on the tablet mounted to the side of the scanner. He wore standard technical gear, a black fleece jacket marked AFSC 3D1X2 on the sleeve, and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. His wire-rimmed glasses kept slipping down his nose as he leaned in closer to the monitor. Despite his age, Devin had a surgical focus to him, the kind that came from growing up with a stutter that made him quiet in school but gifted at observing. He rarely spoke, preferring precision to words. Standing just behind Devin, First Lieutenant Sarah Holt kept her arms folded, face unreadable. Only her eyes betrayed her internal tension. She didn't blink as the scanner passed over the same spot Rex had fixated on moments earlier. Behind her, Sergeant Daniel Cross held Rex's leash in a firm but controlled grip. The German Shepherd was no longer growling, but his body was a coiled spring, muscles tight beneath his sable-black coat. Every breath was slow and deliberate, his eyes still locked on the collar of Kane's uniform, as if he could see something no one else could. Lieutenant Colonel Kane, for his part, sat on the metal chair with his arms crossed, though Daniel noted that his fingers fidgeted slightly against his sleeves. His expression remained calm, but sweat had begun to bead at the edge of his hairline, a small glint visible beneath the overhead light. "You'll be compensating me for this uniform," Kane said quietly, breaking the silence. "It's custom-tailored, not standard issue." Sarah didn't look at him. "If it's clean, there'll be no damage." "I want my legal officer present," he added, tone sharpening. "This has gone beyond screening." "You're not under arrest," she replied evenly. "You're under protocol review. You know the difference." Devin leaned closer to the screen and tapped the image to zoom in. Something had appeared, faint, a shadow within the layers of fabric. He narrowed the filter. Then he froze. "Lieutenant," he said without turning around, "you're going to want to see this." Sarah stepped forward as Daniel shifted to see the monitor. The screen displayed a cross-sectional scan of the collar seam. Embedded in the lining of the left lapel was a thin, flat object no larger than a chewing gum wrapper, barely visible, almost translucent, but it was there. The shape was rectangular, with faint copper traces coiled across the surface like nerves. "Can you isolate the layers?" Sarah asked. Devin nodded and slid his finger across the screen, peeling away the digital image of the outer fabric. The object came into sharper focus. "It's definitely not textile," he said. "There's circuitry embedded, no signature match in the uniform database. It wasn't part of any manufacturing pattern." Kane shifted in his seat. "Probably a tracking tag from the dry cleaner. That happens with civilian tailoring." "No RFID label looks like that," Devin replied, surprising everyone in the room with how certain he sounded. "That's not for laundry. It's active tech." Sarah inhaled slowly through her nose and finally turned toward Kane. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remove your coat." Kane hesitated. "This is absurd." Sarah took a step closer. "Lieutenant Colonel, remove the coat, or I will have Sergeant Cross assist you." With visible reluctance, Kane stood and shrugged off the uniform coat. Daniel moved quickly to take it, laying it flat on the scanning table as Devin reset the scanner's position to sweep it directly. Rex followed the movement, tail rigid, ears locked forward. As the second pass completed, the image of the object lit up in sharp resolution. It was a microchip. Not a simple GPS tag or standard transponder, but something far more advanced. Thinner than a credit card, etched with a pattern of antennae and miniature contacts. Sarah leaned in. "Could be a triggering component," she said quietly. "Some kind of transmitter." Kane sat down again, silent. Sarah turned to Daniel. "We're escalating. I want him moved to room Echo 4, alert Major Tilson in security intel, and lock this uniform as evidence." Daniel nodded and keyed his comm. "Bravo to Control, subject being transferred to Echo 4. Uniform secured. Intelligence liaison requested." Rex remained glued to Kane as two new figures entered, Senior Airman Elias Monroe and Staff Sergeant Reva Dawson, both from base law enforcement. Monroe, tall with dark skin and shaved head, had a reputation for calm under pressure and carried himself with quiet authority. Dawson, shorter and more direct, had a square jaw and quick eyes, known for never hesitating in a takedown. They moved to flank Kane. Kane didn't resist as they asked him to stand, but as he rose, he muttered, "You're making a mistake, a costly one." Sarah stepped forward, her expression steely. "If this is a mistake, the evidence will prove it. But if it's not, you've already made yours." As Kane was escorted out, Devin carefully placed the coat into a clear evidence bag, double sealing it and marking the tag. Sarah remained silent until the door closed behind them. Daniel gave Rex a quiet "sit" and turned to Sarah. He knew. The way he froze. He knew exactly what that thing was. Sarah nodded slowly. "Which means we need to find out what it's for, and whether he's the only one wearing one." Room Echo 4, deeper inside Eagle Ridge's restricted security wing, felt less like an interrogation room and more like a vacuum. Thick concrete walls buffered all outside noise. The fluorescents cast a sterile glow that flattened every shadow, and the only furniture inside consisted of a bolted metal table, 3 chairs, and a mounted camera that never blinked. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kane sat across from Sarah Holt and Daniel Cross, the cuffs on his wrists resting loosely on the tabletop. His uniform had been replaced with a gray base-issue thermal undershirt and trousers. His posture was composed, but his eyes, once sharp with authority, had dulled, and his voice held none of the confident disdain from earlier. A fourth presence joined them now. Captain Trina Vega, a 38-year-old officer from Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOZ, with mocha skin, cropped black hair, and a sharp, perceptive expression that never stopped evaluating. Trina had a reputation throughout multiple bases as a psychological interrogator who rarely raised her voice but always got answers. Years ago, she'd diffused a mole case in Germany involving stolen biometric credentials and had since transferred to domestic counterintelligence. Today, her khaki uniform was pressed and her silver badge gleamed, but her tone was deceptively casual. "Kane," she began, tapping a tablet lightly on the table. "Or should I say, Ethan Voss?" Kane didn't respond at first. Then he gave a slow, humorless smile. "Took you long enough." Captain Vega slid the tablet across the table, On it was a dossier, black and white photo, fingerprints, and a list of known aliases. Ethan Voss, age 52. Former civilian contractor with embedded clearance, disappeared off the grid 7 years ago after being implicated in an internal counter-espionage probe. At the time, insufficient evidence kept the case from escalating, but Voss had fled overseas before final questioning. Until today, he was considered inactive or dead. Daniel sat stiffly beside Sarah, his fingers clasped loosely over his knee. Rex lay on the floor beside him, chin on paws, but his eyes never left Voss's body. Even in a quiet room, even without a uniform to trigger alert, the dog was still tracking every breath. "We've already cross-verified your prints," Vega said. "That collar chip? It's custom embedded. No standard signal, no commercial record, no mistake. So you can drop the act." Voss leaned back in his chair. "All right, let's say I am who you say I am. Then what?" "We start with the basics," Sarah said. "Why were you posing as a senior officer, and what was that device for?" Voss gave a shrug, almost playful. "I needed access, and uniforms still open doors." "We're not playing games," Vega said, her voice calm. "The charge sheet we're building includes impersonation of a military officer, breach of base security, and smuggling of classified-grade hardware. But if you start cooperating now, we may be able to downgrade what comes after that." Voss studied her for a long beat. "You don't even know what you've stopped." "Then tell us," Daniel said. The man sighed, resting his cuffed hands on the cold table. "It started simple. I had engineering credentials. After I disappeared, I got recruited. People with structure, with purpose. People who saw that for every fortress the military builds, there's always a crack, and all you need is the right chip in the right seam to bring a fortress down." "And who are these people?" Vega asked. Voss glanced between them. "You won't find them on lists. They operate in cells. Sometimes they don't even know each other's names. We call it Iron Claw. Mission-based, low digital footprint. I met a coordinator in Istanbul 5 years ago. She gave me my first job." "What was it?" Sarah asked, voice flat. "Surveillance, learning aircraft schedules, identifying vulnerable flight paths, maintenance gaps, personnel habits. Then last year, I was activated for Phase 2. Sarah glanced at Daniel, then leaned in. "Define Phase 2. Voss didn't blink. "Insertion of activation triggers, like the one you found. Embedded hardware, custom-coded, remote-primed. Not enough metal to trip scanners, not enough circuitry to ping normal RF sweeps." "And this one was going to activate what?" Vega asked. Voss smiled faintly. "You already know the answer. I don't need to say it." Sarah stiffened. "Where is the matching device?" "You won't find it on me," Voss replied. "It was already planted, hours ago." The room chilled in its silence. "How many aircraft?" Vega asked. 3, he said, "including the one here at Eagle Ridge. The other 2 were scheduled to depart within the next 48 hours. "Where?" Vega snapped. Voss hesitated. "Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. And MacDill down in Florida." Sarah's pen stopped mid-sentence. "Both carry multi-branch personnel, high-value logistics." "You got it," Voss said. "And you stopped one, which means the others will adapt." "Are those pilots fake too?" Daniel asked. Voss gave a half nod. "Not fake, just persuaded. Or replaced. Depends on the base." "You're lying," Vega said, rising from her chair. "If I was, your dog wouldn't have barked," Voss said evenly. Sarah stepped back from the table. "Get this transcript to Joint Task Force and initiate red flag on both bases. We need ID verification and full pre-flight inspections immediately." Daniel was already on his comm, requesting encryption codes for urgent transmission. As security re-entered the room to escort Voss away, the man stood and looked down at Rex. "You're the one that blew the whole thing up, huh?" he said quietly. Rex stared, unmoving. Sarah turned to Vega. "We're not done. If he's telling the truth, those flights are hours away from liftoff. I want verification of every single personnel record on file for today and tomorrow. I'll loop in AFOSI HQ, Vega said. This just became national command level. The runway glistened under the low Colorado sun, as a fresh sheet of frost melted beneath the roaring hum of idling engines. The massive silhouette of the C-17 Globemaster III dominated the far end of Ramp Sector 4 at Eagle Ridge, its gray fuselage shimmering faintly with condensation. Inside the aircraft, still secured and sealed from the pre-dawn loading cycle, sat 22 pallets of avionics crates, comms gear, and personnel support modules bound for Elmendorf Air Force Base. At first glance, it was just another strategic airlift, but now it had become a potential coffin. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cross adjusted his tactical vest as he stepped into the open cargo bay, the aluminum flooring echoing beneath his boots. Rex, ever alert, walked beside him without a sound. The German shepherd's fur glistened faintly under the harsh white work lights, his tail low, nose twitching with every new scent embedded in the steel bones of the aircraft. Behind them followed the explosive ordnance disposal team, 3 specialists in full protective gear. Leading the EOD team was Master Sergeant Travis Kwan, a 41-year-old with a squared jaw, calm demeanor, and a streak of gray running through his jet-black hair. Kwan was respected across the base for his precision and his ability to diffuse high-pressure situations with unnerving steadiness. At 5'10", he wasn't imposing in size, but his presence carried weight. He'd served in both Afghanistan and South Korea and bore the scars, physical and mental, of near misses and lost teammates. He didn't smile much, but his voice was measured and confident. "Cross," he said as he climbed in behind them, visor raised. "Walk us through the threat again." Daniel nodded. The suspect, Ethan Voss, accessed the aircraft during maintenance hours between 2300 and 0100 last night, claimed to be doing final flight prep. At the time, he presented valid officer credentials and passed Tier 2 background scan. But with the embedded trigger in his collar, odds are he used the downtime to plant something while no one was watching. "Cockpit?" Kwan asked. Daniel motioned forward. "That's our guess. He would have had access." The team moved with practiced choreography. Kwan split his team. Staff Sergeant Emil Torres, a short, broad-chested tech with a mohawk and a nervous tick in his left eye, swept the avionics section. Senior Airman Riley Chen, a soft-spoken woman with striking green eyes and a quiet confidence, took the rear cabin. Kwan took point with Daniel and Rex toward the front. As they reached the cockpit door, Rex's demeanor changed. His stride shortened, his ears perked, tail stiffened. He looked at Daniel, then up toward the pilot seat. "He's got something," Daniel said, tension rising in his voice. "Go slow," Kwan warned, raising his scanner. Rex approached the left seat, pilot's side. He sniffed the base, then let out a short bark and pawed at the underside of the chair. Kwan knelt immediately. "Back him off," he said firmly. Daniel pulled Rex into a sit several feet away as Kwan and Chen, who had just joined them, carefully removed the seat's underside access panel. A narrow compartment lined with wiring and mechanical mounts came into view. To the untrained eye, everything looked normal. But then Kwan tilted his scanner and the screen blinked amber. "There it is," he murmured. Nestled within the adjustment mechanism was a palm-sized device, matte black, almost fully fused into the structure. Barely a millimeter thicker than the surrounding frame, it blended perfectly, until you looked closer and saw the wiring snaking toward an independent power source. Chen whistled softly. "That's not factory." Daniel felt a cold sweat forming on his spine. Kwan motioned to Torres for a secondary kit. Low metal signature, custom casing, could pass any standard pre-flight check without notice. Thermal activated core, probably. Maybe RF linked. "Can you disarm it here?" Daniel asked. Kwan shook his head. "Too risky in confined quarters. We isolate, extract, and move to containment unit." "Worst case scenario?" Sarah Holt's voice cut in over comms. She had stayed behind at the ops center, but had been monitoring the sweep. Kwan glanced at the device, then at the aircraft walls. If this had detonated mid-air, it's mounted under the left seat, right above main avionics trunking. Blast would rip through the floor, sever flight control systems, and possibly decompress the cockpit. At altitude, the crew wouldn't have more than a few seconds. Silence followed on the channel. Even Sarah was quiet. "We're extracting now," Kwan added, switching to internal team comms. Torres approached with the isolation kit, a hard black case with shock-absorbing gel lining and biometric locks. With careful coordination, Kwan and Chen secured the seat, snipped the anchor wires, and gently pulled the device free. As it left the metal chassis, Daniel could see the markings on the side, barely perceptible etchings, non-standard script, nothing traced to any manufacturer. Kwan sealed the case and stood slowly. We'll scan it back at EOD Lab, but I'm telling you right now, Cross, this thing wasn't designed for demonstration. It was designed to kill everyone on board. Daniel looked down at Rex, who now sat silently, eyes focused on the empty chair. Then he saved them, Daniel whispered. All of them. Quan looked over. I'd say your dog just earned more than a commendation. Rex didn't move. He didn't need to. His body, still and poised, said everything. Outside, the sun had climbed above the tree line. The runway was beginning to thaw, but a chill still hung in the air. As the team moved the containment unit off the aircraft, Daniel looked back at the C-17, a quiet giant, hulking and silent. It had almost been the last ride for dozens of personnel, and Rex had been the only one who knew. A cold wind dragged dust across the edge of Eagle Ridge Air Base as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the aging buildings near the northern boundary. Beyond the active runways and hangars, past the supply yards and inactive rail tracks, lay the forgotten zone. Rows of weather-stained metal containers, retired maintenance shacks, and a corrugated warehouse tucked into the corner where the chain-link fence met a slope of pine brush. It was here, among the silent skeletons of discarded equipment, that something darker had been hiding in plain sight. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cross stepped from the Humvee, boots crunching the gravel as Rex leapt down beside him. The dog's ears stood alert, nose already catching the swirl of scents on the wind. His sable coat bristled as he looked toward the collection of rust-flecked containers arranged like a labyrinth ahead. Daniel adjusted the straps on his vest and scanned the layout. The area wasn't monitored by base cameras, deemed non-essential years ago. That made it the perfect place to hide something no one was supposed to find. From the other side of the vehicle stepped Major Brian Hendricks, the Special Tactics Commander overseeing tonight's operation. Hendricks, 44, was built like a linebacker. Broad shoulders, squared jaw, and a shaved head that gleamed under the base's floodlights. A career field officer who had deployed with multiple SOF units, he carried a quiet authority born not from rank, but from the kind of field decisions that meant life or death. He rarely smiled, and tonight he wasn't even blinking. Marchek's last digital trace pinged near the North Utility Tower, Hendricks said, pulling up a thermal tablet. If Voss is right, this is where she's been coordinating. Beside him, Sarah Holt checked her sidearm before speaking. Her winter jacket flared in the wind, braid pinned tighter than usual. Her eyes scanned every corner. Still can't believe she slipped past 5 years of NATO tracking. She didn't slip, Hendricks replied. She was placed, like Voss, embedded early, waited. Rex began tugging the leash, his movement sharper now. Daniel gave a nod. He's picking something up. Send the dog, Hendricks ordered. Team Echo, flank south. Bravo unit on me. The group split silently. Daniel and Rex took point down a narrow passage between two rusted shipping containers. The wind whistled through, catching torn tarps and dislodging an old metal sign with faded stenciled letters, Fuel Test Bench, #3. Rex's breathing changed. He moved slower, more focused, nose to the ground. Then, without warning, he turned left, pulling hard toward a stack of barrels leaning against an old maintenance shed. Daniel followed, speaking softly into his mic. We've got behavior change, elevated alert posture. As they reached the shed side door, Rex stiffened, then barked twice, sharp and purposeful. Daniel raised a fist to signal halt, then keyed up. Target building, confirmed K-9 alert, awaiting breach team. Seconds later, Technical Sergeant Haley Griggs, a compact, fast-moving tactical breacher with red hair tucked under a black helmet, approached with 2 members of Echo. Griggs was known for being the first in and last out, fearless in doorways and dangerously precise. She gave Daniel a thumbs up and placed a breaching charge on the warped doorframe. On your call, she said. Go, Hendricks ordered over comms. The charge popped with a muffled thud. The door flew inward, clattering to the concrete floor. Within seconds, the team flooded inside, rifles raised, floodlights sweeping. The air inside was heavy with solder, oil, and something metallic and sharp, like scorched copper. The interior had been transformed. Where once this had been a spare parts station, now it was a workshop. One side housed a long metal table lined with soldering tools, open circuit boards, and signal testing kits. Racks of uniforms, identical to Kane's, hung neatly on metal rods. Lined up along a back wall were 30 identical black case devices. each one the size of a playing card, each bearing a faint etching. In the center of the room stood a woman, hands up, back straight, eyes calm. Lena Marsek, 39, was unassuming in appearance, shoulder-length brown hair, pale skin, and narrow features that gave nothing away. She wore civilian coveralls and steel-toed boots, hands smudged with grease, but her gaze was razor-sharp. She didn't flinch as Hendricks and two operators stepped in, weapons aimed center mass. "You're late," she said softly. "On the ground," Hendricks barked. Marchek complied without resistance, knees folding as she placed her hands behind her head. Her voice never rose. "If you knew how many hands this passed through, you'd know this doesn't stop here." Sarah entered last, weapons still drawn. Her expression hardened as she looked over the wall of triggers, then back to Marchek. "We're counting on that." Daniel knelt beside Rex, who remained fixated on the rack of flight jackets in the corner. The dog let out a low growl. He stood, moved closer. Inside the lining of one of the coats, he found a stitched collar, identical to the one Voss had worn. The same slightly denser thread. The same weight. "They were preparing replacements," he said aloud. "Multiple ones." Hendricks swept his flashlight over the gear. "This was going to be sustained, not a one-off." Sarah nodded. "This was phase 2. The others were just test flights." As teams began cataloging the contents, loading evidence crates and securing the electronic components, Daniel stood in the center of the chaos, watching Rex. The shepherd had laid down again, head between his paws, but his eyes were still tracking the wall, every movement, every spark of light. "Guess he's not relaxing yet," Griggs said quietly as she passed. "He knows we're not done," Daniel replied. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Snow began to drift across the gravel in soft spirals. The glow of security vehicles lit the perimeter, painting the base boundary in pulses of red and blue. Marchek was let out in cuffs. She said nothing more. The humming of backup generators echoed faintly through the rusted beams of the old maintenance warehouse, now turned covert workshop. Snow swept across the cracked roof above, hissing like static against the aluminum as soldiers moved through the aisles of electronic parts, cataloging everything under the harsh white glare of portable floodlights. The cold had settled deep into the structure, but inside, the air buzzed with urgency. Captain Trina Vega, from Air Force Office of Special Investigations, had arrived moments earlier. She stood at the folding metal table where a ruggedized military laptop sat open, screen still glowing with the Iron Claws interface, non-standard OS, deep encrypted. Vega, in her mid-30s, was lean and sharp-featured, her dark eyes shielded by narrow glasses that glinted as she reviewed the file names cascading down the screen. She was dressed not in a field coat like the rest, but a black AFOC fleece jacket with a shoulder holster visible beneath. Functional, compact, precise, like her demeanor. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. "Start imaging the drive," she instructed Technical Sergeant Olivia Brandt, a digital forensics expert from 4th Cyber Operations Squadron. Brandt, in her late 20s, had dyed auburn hair tucked under her beanie and wire-thin fingers typing like a pianist. Freckled, focused, and known for her dry sense of humor, Olivia had once reverse-engineered a ransomware payload during a hurricane drill. She wasn't rattled by pressure, but the scale of what she was seeing here was making her blink. "This isn't just a local node," Brandt muttered, eyes darting across directories. "They mapped every single transport air corridor across 5 bases. There's base security rotation charts, duplicate clearance badge templates. This is a logistics command playbook." Sarah Holt stood behind them, arms crossed tightly over her chest, posture tense. Her expression was unreadable as she scanned the contents unfolding on screen. Rows of fake identities, false crew manifests, calibration logs for RFID spoofing gear. It wasn't just a plan. It was a multi-tiered infiltration pipeline. "They weren't improvising," Sarah said flatly. "This was years in the making." At her feet, Rex sat still, ears twitching. The German shepherd had stayed near the table for most of the inspection, until now. Suddenly he rose and padded away toward the back wall of the workshop, nose working rapidly. Daniel, watching from the center aisle, noticed immediately. Rex moved past the table of assembled devices, pausing near a steel ventilation panel bolted against the far corner. He growled once, low and deliberate, and scratched lightly at the edge of the panel. Daniel followed, flashlight in hand. "He's got something." Hendricks, standing nearby with a radio in hand, nodded. "Check it." Daniel unfastened the screws with a utility tool and carefully slid the panel off. Behind the metal, tucked behind dusty insulation and a cluster of wires, was a palm-sized black case. Sleek, smooth, sealed in carbon composite. No markings, no ports. "Looks like a dead drop," Daniel said. Rex picked it right up. Sarah stepped over, peering inside. "Anything we can open it with?" Vega nodded to Brandt. "Careful. Use the isolated sled." Within minutes, Brandt had the device secured inside a signal-shielded analysis tray. As the contents loaded on her tablet, her eyebrows lifted. Oh, this is big. What are we looking at?" Vega asked. "It's internal comms," Brandt said. "Encrypted messages between handlers, call signs, drop schedules, embedded ID templates. Look, this one's marked Elmendorf Ops Phase Beta. Another says Eelson Fallback Plan." They were preparing backups for the backups. Sarah stiffened. "Meaning, if we stopped the first 3 flights, they'd activate the next wave," Brandt finished grimly. The room seemed to shrink. The reality of the scale was sinking in. Not just a one-time coordinated attack, but a blueprint to repeat it over and over, slipping inside the very logistics infrastructure meant to protect the country. "Are there names?" Vega asked. Brandt scrolled. "Some are aliases, but a few. These match real Air Force personnel, people who are currently deployed or en route. If these are compromised identities, we've got deeper infiltration than we thought." Hendricks keyed his mic. "Ops, this is Echo Lead. We need a cross-base red flag alert. Initiate manual ID verification for all outbound flight crew at MacDill, Elmendorf, and Eelson. Reference code Iron Claw Sierra." Sarah stepped away, breathing hard. Her fingers trembled slightly, just once, before she tucked them into her jacket. Daniel walked over to her. "You okay?" She nodded, but didn't look at him. "I've seen betrayal before, but not like this. This is quiet poison." Nearby, Rex had resumed his post near the main entrance, but his ears were still angled toward the data rack, as if sensing the gravity that the humans were only beginning to understand. "You think there are more?" Daniel asked. Sarah turned toward the long wall of cloned uniforms and circuit boards. "I don't think we've seen the center yet. This is just a spoke." 2 days after the last arrest, the sky over Eagle Ridge was crystal clear. Snow clung to the pine-dotted slopes surrounding the base, but the tarmac was dry and quiet. An uneasy stillness after the storm. Inside the main administrative hall, however, the atmosphere was far from still. The room was packed. Men and women in uniform filled every row, most standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Dress blues, flight suits, cyber squadron patches, K9 handlers, and crisp black jackets. Every division had someone present. At the front of the room, a temporary stage had been set beneath the banner of the 86th Airlift Wing. The podium bore the seal of the United States Air Force, flanked by flags and lined with chairs. The smell of starch and leather filled the air, and the low murmur of conversation faded as the commanding officer stepped forward. Colonel Martha Reyes, 52, was a tall, silver-haired woman with sharp features and a reputation for strategic brilliance. A decorated veteran of 2 overseas commands, she stood with an elegant authority, stiff posture, the thoughtful eyes, and a voice that always carried clarity over volume. Today she wore her full-dress uniform, the bars of her commendations catching the ceiling lights. Her presence alone brought the room to attention. "Officers, airmen, and honored guests," she began, voice steady. "Today we recognize an act of quiet heroism, an act that prevented catastrophic loss, not just here, but across multiple installations." Her words hung in the room like reverent thunder. Through the swift and instinctive actions of a K9 unit and his handler, Staff Sergeant Daniel Cross, a conspiracy meant to cripple our military transport network was dismantled before it could take flight. Literally. She turned slightly, nodding to the 2 figures standing side by side to her left. Daniel stood tall in his formal dress blues, clean-shaven, boots shined, ribbons aligned with surgical precision. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, eyes downcast, as he tried to keep his hands at rest. Beside him, Rex sat at full attention, black and sable coat gleaming under the overhead lights, ceremonial K9 vest secured around his chest. The vest bore no medals, only the embroidered patch, U.S. Air Force working dog, Rex. Reyes continued. Thanks to their diligence, 2 infiltrators at MacDill and Eielson were intercepted hours before scheduled departure. Both carried devices identical to those discovered here, devices capable of mid-air detonation. The implications of such a coordinated attack are staggering, but they never came to pass, because one dog growled and one airman listened. The hall was silent. Then came the applause, deep, rising, not performative, but honest. Pilots clapped, cyber techs clapped. Even the K-9S stationed in the back barked once, as if sensing the surge of respect in the room. Colonel Reyes raised a small blue box from the podium. By recommendation of Joint Base Command and approval of the Secretary of the Air Force, it is my honor to award the Distinguished K-9 Service Medal to Rex in recognition of life-saving alert and contribution to national security. She turned to Daniel. Sergeant Cross, please kneel. Daniel lowered himself onto one knee, the standard for K-9 commendation ceremony. Rex, well-trained, stepped forward and sat perfectly still as Reyes pinned the silver medallion to the loop on his vest. A light glint flashed off the engraved wings. The hall broke into louder applause. When Daniel stood again, Reyes wasn't finished. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cross, by unanimous recommendation from your commanding officers and the Security Forces Command, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Technical Sergeant, effective immediately. Daniel's eyes widened, lips parting slightly as the room erupted once more. Sarah Holt was among those clapping, standing just behind Colonel Reyes. Her winter braid had been undone for the ceremony, her posture formal, but her smile, subtle and rare, spoke volumes. As protocol concluded and the music played softly from the corner speakers, guests began approaching in waves to shake Daniel's hand or offer Rex soft pats on his shoulder. He accepted each one with polite nods, but it wasn't until the ceremony began winding down that he looked toward the back window. Beyond the crowd, past the glass panels of the hall, the distant runway stretched across the snow-dusted earth like a silver ribbon. A C-17 stood ready, its loading doors open, a new crew preparing for a mission unrelated to sabotage or surveillance. Just another quiet deployment. Rex, as if sensing something, turned his head. His ears twitched. He looked toward the runway, too. Daniel whispered, "You're still watching, aren't you?" The dog didn't move, didn't bark, just stared ahead, alert. Sarah joined them a moment later, holding a small folder with red tape, classified documentation being routed to command. She glanced at Rex, then Daniel. "He hasn't relaxed since this all started," she said. "He knows it's not over," Daniel replied. "Or maybe he just doesn't like dress ceremonies." Sarah smirked faintly. "Then he and I finally have something in common." As the crowd thinned, Vega approached from the side, tablet in hand. Intercept logs from Elmendorf suggest they were already prepping for a 4th operation. Your intel flagged the name from the data cache, Black Nest. Could be the next site. Daniel exhaled. "Then we're not done." "No," Vega agreed, "but thanks to you two, we're ahead now." They watched for another moment in silence as the flag outside fluttered in the winter breeze. Somewhere out on the base, engines revved, the air was shifting again, and Rex, calm and ready, lifted his head and blinked once, eyes sharp and aware. The ceremony might be over, but the mission never really ended. Sometimes comma miracles don't come with flashing lights or roaring thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on 4 paws, with a steady gaze and a heart full of loyalty. Rex didn't ask for medals. He didn't seek praise. He simply followed the voice within him, the one God placed there, to protect, to serve, and to stay alert when others rested. And maybe that's what faith truly is. Not grand gestures or perfect words, but showing up when it matters, staying watchful, listening for the still, small whisper that says, "Go now." In a world filled with noise, chaos, and betrayal, one dog reminded an entire base what trust, obedience, and divine purpose look like. So, tonight, take a moment. Look at the ones beside you, human or animal, and thank God for their presence, for their protection, for the quiet miracles walking beside us every day. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel if you believe loyalty still matters. And if you believe God sends help in ways we don't always expect, type Amen in the comments. May he watch over you and those you love.